everyone for being here. We'll go ahead and get started since it's 3 o'clock, and I'm going to quickly introduce. This is Dr. Beth Herbel-Eisenmann, and she's a former junior high mathematics teacher and current professor of mathematics education at MSU, where she has served as elementary mathematics and secondary mathematics subject area leader and teaches in the secondary teacher prep and PhD programs. In her NSF early career project, she produced and edited together collaboratively with others, promoting purposeful discourse, teacher research in mathematics classrooms, which was published by NCTM. In 2010, she was awarded the Early Career Award from AMTE, and currently with funding from the NSF, she is working with a team of faculty, graduate students, and teachers to collaboratively develop an equitable system that focuses on access to high-quality mathematics and PD experiences, agency to take action or operate on ethics in a learning environment, and that develops allies who help support or act in solidarity with others in this particular purpose. So, thank you, Dr. Beth Herbel-Eisenmann.
Thanks, Irma. So first I'd like to thank MESA for inviting me to come and give this talk, and to Irma for all the time she spent coordinating and organizing the meeting, so thank you, and thank you to the graduate students. So the talk today I titled Examining Modes of Discourse in Math Ed from Positioning and Storylines towards Struggling to Transgress Whiteness in Collaborations. And I put that particular subheading because I want to situate my work first, and a few of the things I've done around positioning, but then move more toward how that has moved me toward the project that I'm working on right now, which is a large collaboration with colleagues where we're working to focus on access, agency, and allies, and through that have just finished an analysis where we look at how whiteness is perpetuated in our project meetings, so that we can learn as math teacher, educator, researchers to try to counter some of the systems of oppression that occur in those project meetings. So the first part I'll sort of trace and situate my current research by giving some overview, both theoretically and the kinds of bodies of work I've contributed to, and then move to this more recent analysis within this particular grant project. So my first major project was a career grant, and we called it Partners in Crime. It was actually Catalyst for Reflective Inquiry in Mathematics Classrooms. And 2 years after I got the grant, this like I do my best thinking when I'm like blow drying my hair, I was like, oh, I should have called it In Math Education, because then it could have been Partners in Crime. And the teachers really liked that, so we sort of ended up calling it that. But from 2014 to 2016, I worked with 8 secondary math teachers in 7 different schools. And the broad goals of the project were to bring together literature on discourse and math classroom discourse with literature on teachers' beliefs to think about how the information on math classroom discourse might actually impact teachers' beliefs and practices over a period of time if they engaged in action research. So the teachers spent about a year reading. We gave them a stack, and they're like, when she does this, it really was like this big of a stack, and we said, what do you want to read? And we had reading groups, and then they picked things that were interesting to them and started investigating their own practice and changing things about what they were doing over a period of time. So we ended up, those are the classrooms, reporting some things about the global study, sort of how things changed over time, and the teachers each wrote their own chapter in the edited book that we published with NCTM. Alongside that, we did a series of studies about classroom discourse, some mixed methods where we were actually doing quantitative corpus analysis, and others that were much more in-depth qualitative discourse analysis, and some theoretical pieces. But one of the sort of common threads across a lot of this work is that we tried to really attend to issues of voice, authority, and control, because those were things that, as the teachers were doing their action research, when we did examinations of the discussions in the study group, those were recurring themes that kept coming up as issues or dilemmas in their practice. And the other piece, or the other major book that came out, was this Equity and Discourse for Mathematics Education. And a lot of the work I just want to recognize by collaboration with Dave Wagner, because he and I have done a lot of He's pushed my thinking a ton, and I just want to recognize how much I appreciate having a good colleague to do some good work with. So when I first did my dissertation, I had only taken one semester course on an introduction to discourse analysis. So in my dissertation, I drew on a whole bunch of different domains of discourse analysis to interpret things based on what I knew about two classrooms that I spent 2.5 years in. So it wasn't really until I got into my career grant that I had time to really dig into particular theories with a lot more depth. So one of the theories I'd been introduced to in my dissertation is systemic functional linguistics. Michael Halliday was most famous for writing about the math register, and David Pym was my advisor. He elaborated on it in his book. But it was really in my career grant that I started reading a lot more about this theory. For me, some of the really key things about this theory that I appreciate are that it really tries to link the things that we say together in a context to broader sorts of things that ideologies, perspectives, framings in the world. So it tries to link the micro with the macro, and in particular this idea of language choice mattering. Every time we communicate with people in a context, we can say things in multiple ways, but the context shapes our choices, often unconsciously or semi-consciously, and those things actually send messages to other people about who we are in the world. So we're sort of negotiating this, like right now, we're playing out right here what a colloquium is, right? It could be a very dramatically different space, but this is what academia has decided happens in a colloquium. So I'm presenting in a particular way, you're participating in a particular way, and it's sort of, and we could link that up to ideologies about how higher education is a white patriarchal space. And some of the modes of communication that have occurred have this long-standing history that's been developed that makes spaces what they are. So it does this sort of link of the kind of language that we use out to other histories and ideologies. So as I started writing using some things from systemic functional linguistics, a lot of the literature, like Mary Schleppergrell's work, Jay Lemke's work, Candia Morgan's work, use the word positions as a verb, like this person positions this person, or this idea positions this. And it wasn't until I started writing things for the math ed audience where they were like, this word keeps coming up, I think you need to tell us more by what you mean by that. Whereas in literacy, people just use it and it's assumed what it means. So, so I did a Google search and found out there was this whole thing called positioning theory. And that took me down that sort of rabbit hole. Positioning theory is actually informed by feminist studies and grows out of cognitive psychology of social action, which hasn't always had the same prominence as some other forms of cognitive psychology. So it focuses on how discursive actions, how positioning, the storylines, and the communication acts that we do, that those interact as a triad. So anytime I communicate with somebody, I'm positioning other people in particular ways, but the storyline that I'm playing out shapes what's happening. And if any one of those things change, the other two change also. So it thinks about this sort of dynamic among these three different things, and again highlights the local context of communication acts with these broader storylines or myths or backgrounds or grand narratives that we play out when we interact. So the grant that followed up the career grant actually was taking these ideas like positioning theory and ideas from systemic functional linguistics to design a set of practice-based professional development materials for secondary math teachers. So in these materials, we offer a set of discourse moves, but we also unpack them to get teachers to think about what happens in relationship to positioning and what happens in relationship to how I'm helping students gain facility with what Halliday calls the mathematics register. So in those PD materials, we took those ideas and tried to make them into things that teachers could grapple with and make sense of. And we piloted those in about 7 different places and have published some various things about those and they just finally, after 2.5 years, are coming out, or just came out from Math Solutions. So one of the reasons that I sort of wanted to highlight this sort of background of my work, because I think it nicely illustrates how whatever you do in your doctoral studies doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you have to do for your whole career. Because as things come up, we also change, and our interests change, and what we notice change, and then we might need other theories to be able to talk about the kinds of things that we see and hear. So alongside the research and the collaborative work that I've done with teacher researchers, and I've been trying to read more about ideologies, sort of critical sociology and things like that, I felt like what I had been learning required me to know more about various systems of power and ideology. So I started reading a lot of authors like Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, and other people who you'll see quotes from throughout the talk that I do. And I started actually attending 4- and 8-day retreats by a group called Allies for Change. They work primarily in the mid-Michigan area, but all over the US, doing training for people who are trying to engage in anti-racist or disability work or gender or class-related work. So I would go to these retreats and do these readings, talk to other people, grapple some with how I perpetuate systems of oppression and understand better some of the ways that I was actually gaining unearned privilege based on the identities that I have that are privileged in broader structures and systems. This led my colleagues at Michigan State and I to start having conversations about how these kinds of things were actually playing out in the coursework that we taught. So we would sit down and talk about our differing experiences in trying to grapple with equity issues with pre-service teachers and methods courses. And we ended up writing a small grant together and hosting a small conference that we called Prompt, where there were sort of 3 major outcomes of that particular conference. One was this really nice cases book that Dorothy White was the lead co-editor on, and it's basically the kinds of conversations that my colleagues and I had. We got people from all over the US to write some of these things that happened to them and then have response cases, and they're really intended for people like us who are math teacher educators to read and grapple with together and open up some conversation around how privilege and oppression operates in the work that we do. The third thing that came out of that conference, because it was seed money from a university, and anytime you have seed money, you're supposed to write a grant. So we ended up writing this grant, Access Agency and Allies in Mathematical Systems, and that particular grant was funded too. So that's sort of where my work has moved and what I'm going to spend the rest of my talk focusing on. But I first want to acknowledge the 12 other people involved in this work. We come from all over the United States. We have 6 other people who worked with us up until last year. Of course, got to thank National Science Foundation. And more importantly, the teachers and students who let us come into their classrooms and who collaborate with us in this work. So most of the work that I've done up to this point has focused much more on reform-based teaching, trying to support teachers to engage students in high-level explanations, argumentations, justifications, but also doing it with equity in mind, in the sense that I didn't just go in and tell teachers what to do. I actually supported them to do action research, got funding for them to get paid to actually meet and talk about their practice, help them collect data in their classrooms and things like that. But as we started reading more about reform-based teaching, we've also learned that it often falls short of equity goals because it focuses primarily on individual teachers and/or classrooms. So what we wanted to do, and what we're working on right now, is designing, facilitating, and studying professional development that really tries to focus on a systemic level through the conscious development of an equitable system. And what we mean by that is intersecting levels of math ed that function synergistically to support the fair distribution of opportunities to learn. And I'll say just a bit more about that in just a second. But from this point of view, you need to bring multiple stakeholders together. And in this case, We have this set of math teacher educator researchers from all over the US. We have a group of math teacher researchers who are working with us, and students in the classrooms. The administrators and community leaders, we've been meeting with community leaders. Administrators, that's a whole other story that I can't get into right now. But really, we're doing it from the perspective of math teachers because other research has shown that classroom teachers are the linchpin for systemic change. And I've highlighted the three groups, math teacher, educator, researchers, math teacher, researchers, and students, because those are the sort of three groups that we're systematically collecting data on about our opportunities to learn. And the features that we are focusing on within the system are access, agency, and allies. So when we talk about features of an equitable system, these are qualities of math education that past empirical studies have shown afford opportunities for groups of people who have experienced long withstanding marginalization to be able to participate fully in math teaching and learning. So access, in our case, focuses on the kinds of resources and practices that enable students and teachers to participate in ways that they're viewed as competent. So the action research component allows them to collect their own data so they can make arguments back to administrators. Students are engaging in different kinds of practices than they did before. Agency is the ability for individuals to act or operate upon objects in a learning environment. So this relates, we can't give agency to people, but we can help create environments that actually are open, where people can come and participate in ways that allow them to bring their full self to the learning environment. And we try to do that and work with the teachers to do that for the students, but also try to do that with the teachers in the PD that we're doing. And then because access and agency really, some aspects of them focus on what Rochelle Gutierrez calls the dominant axis of equity, so really on access and achievement. We also wanted to bring in aspects of power and identity. So some of the way we're conceptualizing agency gets at that, but the idea of allyship is us all coming together to help support and act in solidarity to try to end practices and systems that disempower minoritized communities is the part that we bring to this that I think hasn't been done as much in math education as maybe the access and agency, but we're hoping those sort of attention to the critical access can help us understand some things about how the system acts and how we can be together in ways that work toward equitable relationships. So the particular focus of the analysis that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, we're doing as a collaborative research team with about half of the participants in the grant. We sort of come up with ideas, and then whoever wants to help work on that piece come together and start to work on the piece. So it's myself, Tanya Bartel, Sungwon Byun, Vicki Hand, and Courtney Kessler, and Ashley Scroggins. And this is a chapter that's in review right now. And it's really looking at our own learning in relationship to us trying to be allies, work together as a group of allies. So a growing number of math ed researchers have started to explore the role of whiteness and white supremacy in maintaining inequity and injustice in math education. And in particular, we go back to 2008, even though scholars of color have been making this argument for much, much longer than that. But Danny Martin made an explicit call to stakeholders in math education and policy to recognize math education as a white institutional space, characterized by ideologies and practices that framed as neutral or fair, things that serve to maintain white supremacy. So what we're trying to do in the chapter itself is to argue that we must understand whether and how whiteness is operating to be able to transgress existing boundaries and engage in explicit work to try to disrupt its function in our work. So we examine the mechanisms through which some white researchers on our racially diverse project team instantiated an institutional space of whiteness through our discursive activity. So like a recent piece that Dan Beatty and Luis Leiva wrote, we're not hoping just to name white privilege, because white privilege is the outcome, but really to think about how white supremacy is actually operating and being reproduced in this environment. So this, I'm not going to get into a ton of detail about all of these ideas, but I think that this quote sums up sort of the relationships between whiteness, white supremacy, and white privilege. So whiteness is the ideology that maintains white supremacy, and white supremacy is really the valuing of one racial group over others. So the foundational ideology of whiteness maintains a system of white supremacy, which produces white privilege. Danny Martin and Zeus Leonardo have argued about how whiteness is actually a powerful fiction, and it's supported by a lot of material practices and institutions. So it's different from white people, which is a social identity. Rather, it's about these historical practices and institutions that happen. Danny articulated or characterized white institutional space in more detail in his 2013 article, drawing on the work of Moore in critical race theory, saying that these are four characteristics: the numerical domination by whites and the exclusion of people of color from positions of power in institutional contexts, the development of a white frame that organizes the logic of the institution or the discipline, the historical construction of curricular models based on the thinking of white elites, and the assertion of knowledge production as neutral and impartial, unconnected to power relations. So just to give just a little bit of background, going into a couple of the examples from the analysis, the project members identify we have 5 white principal investigators, but the project team also includes 2 white, 1 black, and 1 Latino senior personnel, 1 black postdoc, and 3 black and 3 Asian graduate students, 1 from Nigeria, 1 from Turkey, and 1 from Korea. So although we know that there's danger in focusing solely on a single dimension of members' identities, we also strongly believe that a focus on race helps us illuminate long-standing racial injustice in US and in math education. So we acknowledge that choosing a racialized term, these are how people self-identified, but that it also is difficult because the identity may not be consistent across contexts and the ways that race intersects with other social constructed concepts like ethnicity and nationality. Other information about our backgrounds is that all of the scholars of color were pre-tenure or graduate students. Everyone in the project had teaching experience and various expertise related to all of the PD ideas that we were working on. The design team for the PD was voluntary, so we asked from the whole group who would like to be involved in designing the PD. 3 white PIs, 2 white senior personnel, 1 African American, and 1 white graduate student worked on the design of the PD. And that Allies for Change group that I mentioned that I had done the various retreats in, they're like the people who I learned things like doing a privilege walk and things like that. So they were a consulting group that also helped us think about what kinds of activities and things could we be doing with the teachers. So a little background about the actual meeting that we analyzed and some information about the transcript. So the meeting took place in May of 2016, and it was 2 months before we were supposed to do our first week-long Teacher Institute that summer in August. The primary focus of the discussion was that the PD design team was going to share a sketch of the plans for that week and get feedback from the whole group before we actually dug in. There's this tension of we had an overview of what we wanted to do sort of day by day, but we didn't have enough details fleshed out. So we were sort of providing this overview. Here's what we're going to do on day 1, day 2, and so on. And we had not even met the participating teachers yet. The superintendent wanted us to go through him before we could communicate with the principals rather than communicating with the teachers. And by the time all of that played out in AERA and NCTM, it wasn't until after this meeting that we actually met teachers who were interested in being part of the project. So we're like planning PD without even knowing who the teachers are. So we selected this particular transcript because it was explicitly aspects about whiteness were brought up in relationship to the PD that we were designing. It ended up, the piece that we chose to start our analysis with was a 63-minute discussion, and it comprised 286 conversational turns. And what I mean by that is there was hardly any overlapping talk, just like when I'm done talking and you ask questions, it's going to be one of us speaking at a time. That happened in this meeting too. So what we did as a group is we each read the transcript and worked on it over a period of time. And then we jointly identified sort of 6 key events from within the longer transcript to look at in more detail. And this sort of practice comes from the qualitative research practice of choosing excerpts to aid in the conceptualization of ideas. We're not trying to make general claims about things that happen in our project, but it really helps us think about conceptualizing and interrogating some of these instances of whiteness in our space. Sorry. So when we went to the final set of transcripts to look at, we kept Danny Martin's description of the characteristics of white institutional space in mind, but we also read a lot of things. There's a lot of theorizing and conceptualizing of whiteness and white supremacy and white privilege, but there aren't as many pieces where it's actually operationalized discursively. We found one piece by Haviland, who was doing an analysis of a course that she was teaching in a teacher education program. She brought some of Jim G's ideas to some of the theories on whiteness and looked at the different ways and sort of operationalized how these things were happening discursively, how whites were maintaining and affirming whiteness in their interactions. So some of the things that she identified were power evasive moves, like avoiding words, engaging in safe self-critique, citing authority, and then there were other ways that whiteness was actually being affirmed in the space. So ways of agreeing and supporting, praising and encouraging, and things like that. Although the context was very different, that she was doing this with a group of undergraduates, the tools and ideas that she offered were helpful in looking at the transcript. So we found at least 4 primary discursive mechanisms that occurred in the interactions. There was, and on the right-hand side are like the white institutional space and some of Haviland's ideas. On the left side, we saw that there was a lot of racial exclusion, especially of scholars of color in the meeting. There was a continued predominance of curricular models created and sustained by white elites. There was a predominance of the conceptualization of trust and readiness, whether the teachers would actually be ready to talk about their own whiteness and related to the work that they were doing in classrooms. And there was powerful yet power evasive white discursive moves that maintained the white status quo. And those sort of played out in the ways that we joked and agreed and disagreed with each other in the meeting. But the piece I want to focus on just today is the second mechanism and how the predominance of curricular models by white elites was being sustained through the ways that we were interacting. So the example in particular I'm going to share with you illustrates how occurred at the project meeting after one of the white PIs asked for more people to comment on the fact that there was little focus on discussing whiteness in the PD, or the history of whiteness, or the overlap between whiteness and mathematics. And hopefully, so after 2 or 3 calls to hear from other people, after having noticed this is turn 176, this is the first time one of the scholars of color spoke out of 286 speaking turns. So we talk about that in a different part of the chapter, but when we asked them to say to comment on it, one of the graduate students said, I think that what we have is a reflection of how we planned. From my perspective, it seems like the discourse strand and the math strand gathered a lot more materials up front. Like there was this shared experience of the prompt conference that I wasn't a part of, and people have that understanding, and it's cool. Then when it came to creating this professional development group, like even in the weeks before, the months before we got here, we had those meetings, and it was like, okay, well, let's lay out what these two groups did, the classroom discourse and math, and then we'll fit other things like cultural connections, privilege, and oppression around those things. So I think it's a product of that process and how we chose to plan. That's why I said earlier it might be worth revisiting how we are thinking about what this really is. Because I think in this process we lost some of that. And somebody asked, lost some of what? And she said, lost some of the commitment to social justice, equity, whatever we're calling this. I think we lost some of this because if we're not gonna do something different, then we're just reproducing more of the same, in my opinion. So the PD itself was focused around 5 strands, and as the team member is noting, 2 of the strands had a lot more work done up front, and we were gonna weave the other strands of culture and community, positionality, which in our project group, we were thinking of it as us and the teachers sort of talking some about our different identities and how race, class, gender might be playing out in the work that we're doing, and the action research piece were sort of woven around those other pieces. So the focus on discourse and math was well-intentioned. The discourse piece included things like attention to status and bias. The math tasks piece focused on things like teaching math for social justice tasks. But they're still drawing on, as Martin reminds us, the work of all those strands is still rooted in white supremacy. We didn't try to come up with something different. So the other piece that I want to draw attention to is this last point that that our colleague made. If we're not going to do something different, then we're just reproducing more of the same. So if we think across all the conversation that happened up to that turn when no scholars of color had spoken, we could say, like one interpretation could be that the white scholars were dominating the floor of the conversation. Another possibility is that we weren't even saying anything that was interesting enough or different enough that was really worth having conversation about yet. And we couldn't hear it. There were, after this turn, 2 other of our colleagues tried to raise questions about the process. And it basically fell on, it wasn't heard until we went back to, I'm like, can you get emotional about this? So the conversation, instead of really centrally taking up the ideas and saying, yes, you're right, what are we doing? It was like, oh, we only have 45 minutes to get to this agenda item. Let's take note of that and then move on to the next thing. And every one of the conversation turns that changed it back to that were all of the PIs who had been involved in designing the PD. The other piece that we became really aware of that actually emphasized white expertise is there were 2 points in time in the meeting where colleagues said, oh, like we're actually using social justice, and of course, so-and-so is an expert on this, and named one of the white scholars in the room. But every single time we referred to expertise of scholars of color, it was always somebody out of the room who was like one of our colleagues at a different institution who had told me this thing about complex instruction or done this thing, this activity, and shared it with me. So we didn't even draw on the expertise of the people sitting in the room. So these sort of implicit and explicit identifications of expertise tended to diminish the opportunity for the project team to really stop and think about the significant experiences of oppression from the everyday lives and expertise of our own scholars in the room, and to help us uncover and develop sort of new sets of expertise and different ways of thinking about these things. So as we're moving forward and trying to think about what do we do to disrupt some of these structures and practices in our group, we pay attention to arguments that Danny Martin and Erica Bullock in particular have made, that a focus on the level of individuals apart from standing back and thinking about the systems operating does not attend to the ways that racism organizes positions and practices for people to take up in their joint activity. So in the chapter, we argue that the tensions that we faced in attempting to transgress whiteness in the design of this PD are really prevalent in the field of math education research. One of the reasons is the continued dominance of white researchers and the privileging of research with the kind of focus that white researchers tend to take. And this is perpetuated by funding agencies and others too, because funding agencies tend to fund continued lines of work that just keep building on the same thing all the time. Sorry, like the heater kicked in over here and I'm dying. So it really perpetuates particular lines of research instead of having sort of new things come up. The other reason is that we really have little to no research on professional development of secondary math teachers that deals explicitly with race and racism. It's possible to take a lens of whiteness and white supremacy to bring to things like classroom discourse practices, critical math education, heterogeneous group work, or the complex instruction work. But most critical scholars have argued that those approaches tend to be incremental and making little to no change instead of more transformative approaches and reimagining what schooling and math education could be that would actually disrupt injustice instead of continuing to perpetuate it. So a few of the things that we've started doing in our project group is to do some of our own work to understand the practices and process. Some of it are doing analyses of the discussions that we're having. We've also brought in Allies for Change to facilitate discussions with us, to really push us to talk about hard issues. People with grant experience might assume that we should just continue doing the same things, like structuring work in small groups like this PD group. So we might have to reimagine the way that we structure grant work, get rid of this sort of silo approach. We didn't have to do a presentation on what the PD was. A completely different thing would have been small groups discussions or something that opened up more participation space. In a recent piece that Julia Aguirre was the first author on from the JRME Research Committee, critically examining the lines of research by doing things like drawing on research and other work by scholars of color to inform how we conceive of knowledge and the relations between mathematics, community, and these broader social issues, not tokenizing people by checking the box to say, oh, I cited this person or that person, but not substantially engaging with the ideas and the critiques. And introducing checks to limit the voices and agendas of white scholars while at the same time creating expansive and different kinds of ways of participating. Irma, do you have the oh, you have the handout? So this particular handout is something that Vicki found. And in our PI meetings, every single time we meet, what this sheet is lists different ways that white supremacy plays out and offers alternative things to consider doing. And what we're doing sometimes in our project work as PIs is spending time within our project time talking about the ways that we're actually perpetuating some of these practices. And you'll see even us describing how we designed the PD and set up that meeting and like worrying about how much time we have to have this conversation. Those are things that are actually perpetuating whiteness. So we're trying to really interrogate and step back and rethink some of the different things that we're doing as a project team. So finally, I want to return to my earlier point about how our decision to focus on race to illuminate racial injustice. That white supremacy is not about individual white people's actions as much as it is about recognizing our own complicity in maintaining its permanence as an entrenched system of oppression along intersections. We don't live single issue lives. So this is even further complicated when you bring other kinds of identities, and Erica Bullock has been making a lot of arguments for work on intersectionality. Macy Golson has done some really, there's a bunch of young scholars who are doing really interesting work around intersectionality, which I want to highlight as being really important because, like I said, although we've highlighted one piece here, it's really reductionist in terms of thinking of people in only one issue. So I want to end the talk by asking people in the room to do the hard work and to be okay with not getting it right. Because at hard work, you have to be able to be okay with messing up. So thank you. Open it up to questions. Kevin?
I'll go first, I guess. Really interesting talk. I enjoyed when you were speaking about agency for a little bit that, often people speak of agency as something to give, right? You made the point like that's not the case. And I was wondering how do you look at positioning in the same way? Because I noticed in your phrasing, right, it's like I position someone in a certain way. But I was wondering how you look at positioning from like the perspective of that person that's being positioned. And, how do you take that into account?
I think with positioning theory, there's always the option to disagree with the positioning. And the only time, so there's first order, second order, and third order positioning, and first order is all of them that just happen. Second order happens if somebody realizes that they're being positioned in a way that they don't want to be positioned in, and they actually counter it. So it still has the agentic role of a person who's not speaking but is listening to actually disagree with and change the positioning by virtue of the communication act they choose in the response. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I have several questions. So I have 3 of them that may or may not go together. So what are some of the big takeaways that you have after doing this research, like on your own meetings? Like have your meetings changed, like the way you've conducted them, and then how have you decided to change them after that?
So in addition to talking about the bullets on this sheet and trying to change, we've also gone to a rotating structure where a different person facilitates each meeting and they can choose how they want to structure it. And Vicki had started doing something on a different grant where she creates a small survey at the end through Google Surveys, where we spend the last 15 minutes, everybody types in responses, like how do you think things went today? What did we do that you thought was a good use of our time? What did we do that wasn't? Do you feel like you had an opportunity to participate in the ways that you hoped you would? So people can respond, and boom, we just get anonymous and can look across the set really quickly and then have an explicit discussion about how the meeting went around either themes that come out of the survey or, so we're trying to put some different things in place. So we'll see how it goes. Since we just did this analysis like in September, it's just starting to shift some of the things that we do. Did that get all of your questions?
I'll let some other people ask stuff I want. I have another one. Keep going.
You're ready? You got 3 days.
What are some of the things that you did in your PD? So you mentioned like the privilege walk, and then was that only for math teachers or was it for?
Well, so we had written the grant for middle school teachers, partially because that's such a significant point in the schooling trajectory around when kids start getting disinterested in mathematics and the transitions between buildings and all of those things. But by virtue of the way that we were allowed to communicate with teachers in the district, we actually ended up with people from grades K through 9. And all of them were teaching math until the week before school started. One person who was supposed to teach math got moved to social studies. Another person got moved who had been teaching something else got moved. So they move people around, like even 3 months into the school year starting. So we now have 2 people who aren't technically teaching math, but they're trying to do connections between social studies and mathematics or language arts and mathematics. So we ended up with a much broader range of content background than we had imagined we were going to have. So we did things like the privilege walk. We did, Julia Aguirre came up with this graffiti wall activity where you would post different sorts of stereotypes so we could unpack and reframe things that people heard kids said about the kids that they work with. I think she's got a piece coming out in the Math Teacher Educator soon about that particular activity that was super helpful because they've done it in multiple sites and have collected data around it. We also did things like group-worthy tasks together and talked about how do you modify a task to first make it high cognitive demand, but then to also make it group-worthy, drawing on complex instruction. We did community walks together and talked about getting to know the community and that the children come from. Most of the teachers have lived in the area for a long time, but only a few of them actually live in the city that they teach in. We watched videos of teachers teaching. We looked at how you can actually build on students' interests in things they care about to design teaching math for social justice tasks. Those are some of the things. But we did a 5-day retreat and then met twice a month through the school year, and the teachers did their own action research projects with our support. And then they came back the next summer and we did 3 days, and 1 day focused on youth. The whole idea across the 3 days was opening up space for more student voice. So we did some things on youth participatory action research. We did some things on critical mathematics education. And then the third one was thinking about cultural narratives and bias. So we spent a half day on each of those, and then they used that to redesign collaborative action research projects where we keep pushing on how are you opening up space for student voice. Because oftentimes it's much easier for me to design the survey that we give rather than help like working with kids. So we keep pushing on that. Denise.
So I'm curious as to how you think about a role of knowledge and experience among your research team, because I acknowledge that the fact that all of the PIs and senior personnel, the fact that they're white is a result of structured inequities that have led to white privilege, but there is also, you do have experience and knowledge that more novice researchers, those newer to the field, don't have. So how do you think about that piece of it around issues of power and agency? I mean, ultimately as a PI, you're responsible to NSF for what happens. It's your promotion case. It's, you know, you have responsibility to these teachers and what you committed to the school district you would do as PI.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a key tension in the, like, having to get stuff done. Like, we're finding ourselves all the time, combined with, like, this focus on outcomes, and rather than like really focusing on the process and how things are done. I'm trying to remember which one it was. So I think some of it has been a lot of the ideas around the things we've started doing analysis have come from people who are untenured or close to the tenure process, and other people supporting them to do the analysis and writing as co-authors instead of us being the first author of things. But also, like, I'm now reading things from Lat Crit that I hadn't read before because one of the authors is really interested in that. So I'm like reading all kinds of new literature to try to learn new ways to think about the studies that we're doing in the context that we're in. So I think it's this sort of mutual learning where sometimes I'll push on something and then like recognize that what I'm doing is really pushing conventional ways of thinking about something and have to step back and just say, like, if you don't agree with what I'm saying, that's totally fine. We don't have to do it that way. So I think we have a lot more conversation about process. And we spend a lot of, we very intentionally spend a lot of time doing relationship development, checking in with each other, Zooming. When we meet, we do lots of different things together. We have Allies for Change come to actually engage us in conversations about how the work in the project is going, considering all these different status, untenured, graduate student, tenured, like that, gender, race. They're really skilled facilitators, and they get us talking about things that we probably wouldn't talk about if we didn't have a skilled facilitator come in. Notice there's no hands being raised.
I guess I have a question. You talked about the Allies for Change and them being, skilled facilitators. I guess, have you taken a moment and stepped back and look and see, what is that skill set that they have kind of developed and helped you kind of think about and work with?
Some we have. And then there's really good sets of readings that have been written about facilitating challenging discussions. And we also end up doing it with the teachers because things come up in the meetings. Deficit language is pervasive everywhere. It's in policy documents, it's in administrator talk, so we have those challenging discussions in the PD, and half the time I'm like, okay, this is like a train wreck about to happen and I don't even know what to do. And so we'll debrief that after the meeting. People will be like, oh, I might have asked this question. So we sort of brainstorm with each other about alternative ways we could have had those discussions. So we're working on it. Definitely have to be okay with not getting it right.
I was going to ask if you had thought about, or if you maybe are already doing some of this, some of the professional development work that you're doing with your teachers, with pre-service teachers?
So some of the activities that we've gotten are things people have been doing with pre-service teachers. Or like, we have our colleagues who teach our social foundations course that focuses on schooling as an institution that perpetuates the marginalization of different communities and race, gender, class. They've shared different things with us that they do in those classes too. So we are using things that our colleagues use in teacher preparation. They just don't tend to make their way into the math methods course. And now I'm using some of them actually in my math methods courses too.
Early on, you had a slide that had a list of things that people do that sort of perpetuate whiteness, and one of them was false starts. What does that mean? Because in my head, my initial reaction to that is that's sort of the opposite of being okay with not getting it right. You're going to make false starts in this stuff, so what does false starts mean in that context?
I'd have to go back to Haviland's piece. Probably what happens after the false start probably matters.
It's retreat or try again.
Yeah. We didn't see that as much as we did the you all have done just like such excellent work. Like, I can't believe all the things that you came up with, but I really want to ask about this. So there's like this like gratifying people making you feel good about something before you're willing to push back on the harder things to talk about. That was more of what we saw in our meeting.
I'm just the camera person.
So what's a really concrete example of something you would do in a group if a teacher says, my kids can't, don't have, won't, weren't prepared for, or these kids? How do you respond in concrete ways to those kinds of sentence starters from people? Or administrators or whoever?
We've done a lot of different things. I mean, I think it started some with the graffiti wall and talking about how these are discourses that are perpetuated by a lot of different stakeholders but then thinking not just about what those are, but also how do you reframe them. And Julia has quite a few examples of that in the, and I, off the top of my head, wouldn't be able to think of one right now, of course. We've also just talked explicitly about what deficit language is versus strengths-based language and reframed. Like we had an example of a write-up somebody had done at a community walk and an alternative version of it and talked some about why do those differences matter when it happens in the moment. We talked some to the teachers. So we have group norms, and one of them is no shaming and blaming. Another one is don't freeze each other in time, because we're all in a process of learning about these things. So we talked to them about when we hear each other do these things, how do we hold each other accountable? And they've requested that one-on-one or small group, to say, I heard you say this, here's a way somebody might interpret that. Is that what you meant? What are other ways we could have said that? So we have explicit conversation, but we don't do it in the whole group because they feel like that couldn't happen without them feeling like they were being shamed for what they said. Because there's also this, if you're micromanaging what they say all the time, they're going to stop talking about what's happening too. And then you can't work on those issues together. So it's a balance that I haven't figured out. Sometimes I feel like I'm going in like a bull in a china shop, and other times I'm like, holy smokes, I don't even know how to stop what's happening here right now. And we have multiple people facilitating, so that helps too, because other people can step in, and when I feel like I'm failing miserably, 20 years of doing professional development, and I fail miserably on an almost everyday basis with trying to do this work. Because it's different work and it's hard.
Last question, or can end it there? All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.